Well, Your Holiness, I hope that everyone has had an enjoyable lunch and that you have as well. Welcome back to you all. We'll now be moving.
Tomorrow.
Rela, ngansu the consular shusai. Oh,
All Tibetan in free country. Tomorrow fasting.
Tomorrow is
yes.
fasting.
Yes. Yes.
Some of our supporters.
Yes.
I hope. I hope.
So His Holiness is referring to the fact that tomorrow morning, actually, you already know that there will be a memorial service for the various members of the monastic community who have been protesting even with their own bodies in Tibet. And in partial honor of that, tomorrow, I understand, is a day of fasting in the Tibetan community, in the free Tibetan community. So we will be beginning late on that rather sober note, but in some ways an appropriate note, because it then brings us into the realm of ethical action and activism in general. And we'll begin by the consideration of ethics, Your Holiness, this afternoon. Some 2 years ago, we began planning for this meeting when Dan Goldman and I first were given the green light by the Mind and Life XXİ to plan the meeting. We started to think about what were the essential elements in understanding the environmental crisis. And we were joined pretty soon within our planning process by Jonathan Patz on our committee. And it became evident, in part because of Jonathan's own work in ethics and science, that ethics are a crucial component in the environmental crisis. In some ways, of course, as you pointed out, one role of ethics, a very important role of ethics, is to guide our actions once we have understood what is in fact the case. In other words, once science gives us a clear understanding of the scientific issues, the reality that we face, we then have the question of what our ethical choices might be. But also, there is a way in which ethics precedes the science. For example, just to give you one example, on May 21st of this year, it was claimed that the world would end. There was a man named Howard Cutler, a very well-known radio personality, who had convinced a very large number of his followers.
So
next year.
when would it end?
That's this last year,
I see.
May 21st.
I heard number of people ask 2012.
Also,
That's end of world.
yes,
Nonsense.
yes. Well, it was
Then no need on serious discussion.
yes,
Everybody then relax and alcohol.
yes.
Then wait that day.
There were many parties on that day, actually, Your Holiness. Surprisingly, many people took this very seriously. Some people in the United States actually sold their possessions.
Really?
Yes.
Oh.
Went up into the mountains.
How easy to fool them.
Yes. But the problem is there's even a significant percentage of the American voters who believe that the world probably will end relatively soon. Maybe not May 21st, but in the not too distant future. With that attitude in place, there's no point in trying to preserve our environment. Environmental silence is a waste of time. Those types of attitudes can be very destructive for the science itself and can be an obstacle to science.
We Buddhists also have some kind of similar way of expression.
Yeah, so for example, like there is no real point to
Life is
intrinsic meaning to the existence of
this
life.
life. We must think about next life.
Yes. Or
So therefore, 1954 and 55, when I was in Peking, one occasion Chairman Mao told me Buddhism, religion is poison, opium. Then he mentioned two reasons. One, great sort of harmful for population. It's half true. Then he mentioned the Buddhist sort of faith. There's a reduced interest about development.
Progress.
Progress. So anyway, if you
misinterpreted.
misinterpreted 말다. holistic map 지침이 있나? 딱 제주서 별로지 않으시는데 차는 자기는 말 봐.
So if you don't understand a particular concept within its wider context, you can easily misunderstand these kind of ideas.
Yes. And this also points, Your Holiness, to the question of values, another which is very connected with ethics. Another issue, for example, that really also came up this morning is if we really only value profit, and that's all we're concerned with, we might not care about the environment or the impact it has on others. So with that attitude, one's own political power and economic power would actually seek to block environmental science because it's an obstacle, one might think, to profit. This might be a confused notion, but it still could be the way that one would act. So ethics are actually important even before the scientific work. I think it's a crucial issue to understand how we have found ourselves in this environmental crisis. So with that in mind, what we had to do was go out and find an ethicist. And we did so in the form of Dr. Claire Palmer. Dr. Palmer is from now a professor at Texas A&M University, where she is in the Department of Philosophy. She did her graduate work and indeed all of her university training at Oxford University. But she has a background not only in philosophy, also in religion, and much of her work is at the intersection, the meeting places of religion, philosophy, and the environment. Much of her work has focused on animal ethics and the treatment of animals. And for that reason, also this afternoon, toward the end of our session, we're going to ask the Venerable Mathieu Ricard to pick up that theme after our conversation about Dr. Palmer's presentation. Venerable Mathieu Ricard would say something about our treatment of animals. Back to Professor Palmer then. She was the president of the International Society for Environmental Ethics from 2007 to 2010. She founded an important journal in this new area of philosophy called Worldviews, Environment, Culture, Religion. And she's also co-authoring now a book on the ethics of companion animals, our pets. What kinds of ethical positions and attitudes should we have or might we have toward our pets? Her most recent book, if I recall correctly, is Animal Ethics in Context from Columbia University in 2010. She has also co-edited a number of volumes, including the 5-volume collection called Environmental Philosophy from Routledge, which came out in 2005. And part of the reason that when I was doing my research to look for someone who might be able to help us to understand these environmental ethical issues, I read various articles and I came across an article that Dr. Palmer had written that was amazingly clear. It laid out the various positions within environmental ethics and the way that philosophers throughout the world are thinking about environmental ethics. So that's actually part of what she will do today. She will introduce us to some of the key positions in environmental ethics and then raise for us some interesting questions that we might consider in the conversation. So, Dr. Palmer.
I'm honored to be able to meet you and to talk to you today. And as John said, my role in this conference is to introduce some perspectives from environmental ethics. So what I'll do is say something about the key positions in environmental ethics, and then I'll talk about 3 fundamental problems about which environmental ethicists are still arguing. So Diana, Jonathan, and Greg have introduced us to some ideas about different kinds of impacts that we have on the environment. What environmental philosophers do is to pick up on that work and then think about, well, what values are at stake here? What kinds of ethical issues do these raise? How should we behave with response to these particular kinds of problems? So that's what we see our role as being. So I should just say something about the field of environmental ethics. It's relatively new. Really began in the late 1970s, early 1980s, but has grown a lot. And now there are many universities across Europe and the United States and Australasia that teach environmental ethics. However, because it's a younger field, or maybe not because, maybe it always will be, it's very contested. There is very little consensus.
the environment ke langdo kol jugdo kol ke shege yonzan.
There's very little consensus about basic positions in the field about the fundamental questions, or even what those questions are, let alone how to answer them. And as I'm sure that you have seen when you have met philosophers before, wherever there are two philosophers in a room, there will be at least three opinions. And environmental ethicists are just the same as that. So
that's why more reason to believe scientists. I think the fact is, the reality, many aspects.
It is a fact that there's no way a one word and the concepts that is based upon that, derived from that word, is ever going to capture reality.
자자가 자도 세워주고 무슨 두해주고 써야 돼.
So therefore, in Buddhist philosophy, a distinction is made between the way
Not
in
only
which
Buddhist philosophy.
in classical Indian
In Indian philosophy.
classical Indian philosophy,
I think more than 3,000 years.
a distinction is made in the way in which, direct perceptual experience engage with the world vis-a-vis conceptual thoughts. Thoughts tend to be very selective and pick on only a facet of reality, whereas direct experience can engage with the object much more kind of, in a kind of a direct way.
So naturally, the philosophical sort of thinking is pick up one aspect. It's true. At the meantime, if that philosopher say this is the only truth, then mistake. There are different aspects from different angle, isn't it? Okay. Yes.
So we cannot be gurus.
Tarumaozo lama cheyo maros. Seribozo guru sumbrwa. Tarumaozo guru tel sugyo maros.
Oh, semi-guru.
Semi-guru. Semi-guru. Quasi-guru.
There is, though, one thing on which most environmental ethicists do agree, and that is that we're seeking reasons and explanations for the kinds of values that people hold. So when people make claims that something should be protected or something is important, philosophers are asking, well, why do you say that? What reasons do you give for that? And that's been one of the jobs that environmental ethicists have undertaken. So unlike my colleagues in the sciences, I only have 2 slides, well, 3 after this first one. And I'm going to use one slide, which John helped me design yesterday, to outline some of the basic kinds of positions in the field. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. So as you can see, if you look at this slide, there's a fundamental kind of divide between 2 sorts of concerns. So one kind of concern is human-centered, and the other a non-human-centered. And that's been a big debate within environmental ethics. Now, of course, some human concern, they're not necessarily in opposition to one another. So something could benefit both humans and non-humans at the same time. So co-benefits, to use the term that Jonathan used yesterday.
레펜준이가 즉 초타지도 계획 잡았잖아요, 말했어. 간다가이는 즉 멜팽규는 미마이 베트르레 긴거들을 펜톤이들 용식으로 봤다. 이는 자외 따단들이야. 미케제 진이 미대 된 것도네. 삼만단단 직단 야 미마인 베지단 야 튼루단 긴거 공부 개체 진. 엔디 토네 야 랑도주단 개시나 다 랑초로 자원이 도스.
And it seems to me that if you're going to have co-benefits, you'll have to have co-harms as well. So something could harm everything, some action that we perform. So what I want to do is to start on this side and talk about some of these human-centered positions. So the first one I've outlined here, I've called ecosystem services. And this concept was something we talked about yesterday. So these are the free services that nature provides to human beings. And environmental ethicists have been interested in this because they point out that this is very important for our own well-being, that we recognize the ways in which we are dependent on the natural world, and that can be denied in our practices. But they want to emphasize that for prudential reasons, for our own well-being, we need to think about this. So that's the first one. I'm not going to say very much about that. The second idea, ideas about beauty and ideas about place, these are sometimes included within ecosystem services, but I wanted to separate them because I think interest in beauty and the value of place are not easily captured by using the language of services. They're really things that we value rather than services that are provided to us. So some philosophers argue that natural beauty has some kind of intrinsic value for us. And certainly beauty has been something that has underpinned the protection of the natural world in many places, especially in the United States, where the national parks were formed in beautiful places initially. However, there are some concerns about weighing natural beauty or beauty too heavily. For instance, ideas about what's beautiful have changed over the centuries. So somewhere that's protected may lose value. Another concern is that some ugly things may be very ecologically valuable. So a corpse full of maggots may not be very beautiful, but will be very significant for other reasons. And and equally, there could be something very beautiful, like a beautiful sunset, that we later discover was caused by pollution. So the cause there may be problematic. So that's some ideas about beauty. Place is also very important to people. People become rooted in particular places and come to value the places in which they live and will try very hard to protect those places. And again, the value of place has been very important in environmental protection. So again, this can be problematic. So it might be that people protect a place against, for instance, putting windmills there to generate wind power. So sometimes valuing place can conflict with other kinds of environmental values. So those are two kinds of ideas. The third idea, human-centered concern, I have here is a concern for justice. And this has already arisen several times. Jonathan talked about environmental justice issues yesterday. And here the concerns are about the ways in which the environment can be a cause of injustice between different groups of people. So, for instance, one group of people might capture a natural resource and prevent other people from accessing it without consulting them and without compensating them. This might happen, for instance, if a dam is built, and that may have the effect, people are pushed off the land. They don't benefit from the electricity that's generated. They didn't cause their own movement, but they end up suffering disproportionately. And there are very many kinds of cases like this. And environmental ethicists have spent much time thinking about these justice issues. The fourth area of big debate is thinking about future people, people that don't yet exist. And I'm not going to say anything more about this here because this is one of the main disputes that I want to talk about later. So now I'll move over from the human-centered to the non-human-centered views and talk about these views. So here again, there's a divide where people have disputed, and this divide is between those who argue that individual organisms are what matters, and those who argue, and I've used the word holist here, which people use in lots of different ways, and I've heard people use it today. This is ecological holism, and people who take this view argue that ecosystems and species are morally important units in themselves. Or the land, or sometimes people talk about biotic or land communities, and that these are important. And so there is this dispute between those who argue what matters is individual organisms.
다간다 고유 개체 중 골삼당백깔이야 미대된다 대와 장장 그돈 삼당다 지르바 다 파나운데 미든 대와메바 미마인베 간다직 소자에나도 갱외에나 될 삼당 고유 용조를 삼당 되게 돈 따당 돈에 고유 개체 중 삼당당 직체 델낭 세니체는 지기 다간다직 개인 용어를 안 수중원에 그렇게 수중은 individual organism 그 림베톤에 개침부터 그랬으니 지금
원래 이제 미말봐.
미말에 다 반항어디 말에다 뒤에 차진 용조 그 찬들 그런 직 두무르 직지제 랑 말았을도 그런 좀 많았을 것도 시스템 그래도네 개침부터 있다고 그랬어요 지금 또 단다 또도 개버죠 랑도 골이야 그 랑도 죽당 고유 송교 돌 삼당당데 골이야 다직 시샤사 가르게 제마지 뒤고 쉬고는
So I'll now look at these two views. So these are people who argue that individuals are what matters, and the first group of people here argue that what matters are beings that can have experiences, that have lives that can go well or badly for them, that can suffer pain and pleasure, and in particular, this is animals, mammals, human beings, mammals. And perhaps fish, perhaps reptiles. There is some discussion about whether those beings can feel pain. The scientific evidence is unclear. And then the last category here is those people who say, well, thinking about individual sentient animals is not going far enough. What matters are beings that are alive, not whether they can feel pain or pleasure alone. And so all living things are morally important, and we need to take them into account. But there are disagreements here about whether all living things are equally significant, or whether some beings are worth more than others, or more significant because they can feel pain or for some other reason. So there are lots of arguments even within these categories. And then over here, the two main kinds of views here are about whether ecosystems are morally significant. So the people who adopt this view argue that we should see the land as being morally important in itself. And the people who take this view argue that species should be thought of as a morally significant unit, that there's something very bad about a species going extinct that's worse than the last individual member of the species dying. So, for instance, there's something worse about the loss of the last tiger than the loss of a pet cat, because the species itself is valuable. And not just because it matters to us, or because it's bad for all the individuals of that species, but the species itself is a unit that we need to take into account. So that sets up the different kinds of views that environmental ethicists take. Now I want to, I won't change slide because I'll keep this one on. Now I want to talk about three kinds of problems about which there's lots of dispute. So the first kind of problem I want to talk about is about future people. So it seems clear, and people have raised this already, that future people, we can harm future people in various kinds of ways. We can leave a legacy of nuclear waste. We can change the climate. We can cause pollution. We can cause climate change. We can make species extinct. So we can have many negative impacts. But how to think about this ethically has been very troubling for environmental ethicists, and indeed for Western ethics more generally. So there are some philosophers who argue that we shouldn't take future people into account at all. They are not morally relevant. And one group of people who takes this view are some human rights theorists, not all of them, but some of them. So they argue that...
It's only the thing in that case, our later part of our life is not
Does not exist.
not a reality today. Does not exist.
But we have to take serious concern about the later part of our life.
Because our own future life does not yet exist.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah. So this is something I wanted to ask.
So this is children, grandchildren, grandchildren. You have to take care.
Care long.
That is silly, I think. Silly view.
I'm sure those
Sorry. Not how you sing Marta.
So he's all in this thing. He's not in a position to adjudicate between these positions.
Yes.
So these philosophers argue that to have rights, you must exist. And since future people do not exist, they are not able to claim rights, they can't recognize rights. So for that reason, they can't have rights. So we should just discount them and not think about future people. However,
진짜 삼동에 미지 알아. 미르지마 삼동 말세 알아. 그저 제기 난주 빨라도 아무라지 노하샤사로 빨라도 아무라 야우샤시 스기요나면아.
So His Holiness is wondering, these kind of theorists who argue that the future generations are not shouldn't be part of the equation, will they ever, in their own life, complain about what their ancestors did? Saying that...
Or some appreciation, or my father, my grandfather used to done something good. Now I have to sort of utilize
experiencing the
these
benefits.
things.
No?
So then similar. If we do something wrong, they will complain. Yes.
so more philosophers argue that future people do matter, though for different reasons. So some say we can harm future individuals. Others argue there will be more suffering in the future if we behave in particular kinds of ways. So there are different sorts of arguments. But even if this is accepted, this creates many difficulties about how to factor future people into decision making. So there may be cases where the interests of present people and future people may conflict with one another. So development that might help some present people may harm some future people. So that's one kind of problem. Another kind of problem is, and I think this has already been raised, is that the motivation for present people to take future people into account is very weak. One reason, and I think Elke will talk more about this, is that many people think that to resolve some of the environmental problems we currently have, we'll need to make collective agreements between ourselves that will benefit all of the parties that join the agreement if everyone keeps the agreement. However, future people can't join in collective agreements because they don't exist. So they can't be represented, they can't take part in them, and so we're not motivated to include them because we don't benefit from them joining an agreement with us. We can harm them, but they can't benefit us. It's a one-way kind of relationship. And another reason why we're weakly motivated with respect to future people, and this came up in a discussion we all had the other evening, is that it's very difficult to feel compassion for beings that don't yet exist. So while we can feel compassion for a distant person and we can see a picture of their suffering, we can feel compassionate towards them, for beings that are non-existent, that motivation is going to be difficult to achieve. So that's another kind of concern there.
There's a Buddhist classical Indian Buddhist philosophical school who argue that everything that exists must exist in the present. So it seems to be quite similar line of thinking.
That would be very demanding if we had to take into account everything that would ever exist in the future now.
So even in the case of these classical Buddhist philosophers who insist that to be real is to be real now, also worry about what happens to them in tomorrow or day after.
Because as a matter of fact, you see, these are Buddhists, so they also is talking about nirvana. There's a future. Okay.
So this is one kind of problem, and I'm going to, at the end, put up 3 questions of things that I'd like to discuss, and this future people question is one of those questions. So the second issue I wanted to talk about was what to think about systems and species, since that is a big problem for environmental ethics. So it seems as though there's something right about the insight that when we think about environmental problems, we're not just thinking about lots of individuals. So we don't normally think, when we're worried about an environmental problem, we don't think that what we're concerned about is the effects on individuals. We're concerned about much bigger effects. We don't, for instance, think that a tree plantation from planted trees is the same as an old forest that's never been cut, even if there were exactly the same number of organisms in the plantation as the forest. So we think there's something different in a system than we do in a plantation, for instance. However, it's very difficult to get a grip on what it is about a system that might make it morally significant. So very famously, the philosopher, well, he was a forester and a philosopher, called Aldo Leopold, an American, claimed that we should follow a land ethic. And
land ethic,
land ethic.
And the land ethic says a thing is right as long as it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the land community. It is wrong as it tends otherwise. So that was his very famous sentence. So all students of environmental ethics that don't know that are in trouble. However, individualists dislike this view. They say, well, ecosystems don't really exist in the way that someone like Leopold thought that they did. There are, in fact, not kind of coherent wholes with integrity and stability out there. We can't clearly identify the boundaries of ecosystems. We can't pick them out. They're much more chaotic than Leopold thought that they were. Organisms arrive randomly. They have relationships with one another, but they're not systematic in this kind of sense. And even if they were, why would we think that something like integrity of a system mattered morally anyway? It's not the right kind of property to matter. What would matter is whether it could suffer. And we know, for instance, and we know that ecosystems don't suffer. Some individuals might suffer. Similar arguments are made about species as well. So those who think that species are morally significant argue that species have interests that aren't the same as the interests of the members of the species. So, for instance, if we had a species with only 50 remaining members, in order to keep the species going, we captively bred all of the species, and all 50 had horrible lives because we were doing horrible things to them in order to make them breed. So the species then might flourish, but the individuals have a terrible life. So you might say, well, then that was in the interests of the species, but not in the interests of the members of the species. So we can make a distinction. However, an individualist will come back and say, that's the wrong interpretation of what's happening. All that's really going on is you're sacrificing the interests of present individuals for benefiting future individuals, and there are more of them over time. So ultimately, you benefit more individuals, and that's all you mean when you say the species is flourishing. So as you can see, this is a very important dispute. It's going to affect environmental policy, because there are many cases where individuals are sacrificed for systems. So, for instance, some kinds of hunting of species that of overpopulating ecosystems where individuals suffer to benefit systems. But if systems are not morally important, that seems problematic. So it's policy relevant, that particular problem. So that's the second problem I wanted to talk about. And the last issue I wanted to discuss brings these together and addresses the question of what kinds of future environments do we want to create? Some ethicists want to say that's a bad question, that's an overreaching question, that ethics should really only be about things like not harming or not infringing upon rights. And it shouldn't be about bringing things about and trying to create better worlds. But many philosophers say, but we are already creating a world. We've heard talk about the Anthropocene yesterday. That seems like a kind of, that we are creating a new human... So these philosophers argue that given that we are already creating a world, we need to try to create the best world possible, or at least a better environment than we are currently doing. But as I've already suggested, it's not clear
so
what
the distinction, just to be clear, the distinction between these two positions is one is saying the role is to avoid harm, not so much to
bring things about.
Be more proactive and make them happier kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is that the
Yes, that's the distinction. So, if there is a goal to create a better environments, better future environments, then the question is, what would they look like? What is a better future environment? And since there are many different views about what matters, as we've seen, what would constitute a good future environment is very problematic. And a further complication is that something like climate change, while as we've seen, it will produce various kinds of harms, also will create a new environment with new systems, new individual organisms, and many of those new organisms, for instance, will be as valuable as the other organisms that would have come into being had they existed. So it's very difficult from some kinds of views even to say there is a problem about climate change. So, for instance, we know that one current effect of climate change is that there is less tundra and that the forest is expanding into the tundra in Siberia. Is that bad? Is that a harm? Does it matter that there will be more forest and less tundra? Has an ecosystem been harmed? Has the tundra been harmed? So
Siberia tundra.
Oh yes.
So one kind of vision that many people think is important is that if whatever a future environment should be like, it should contain less suffering. And that's a view that's very common. But ethicists find this problematic too. For instance, it might suggest it would be better to have a world with fewer organisms that can suffer in it. So more trees, fewer sentient animals, then you avoid more suffering. Or it might mean that
따로 마워서 저부터 난시고 따로 마워서 다 제배 고망 무시우지.
Or it might mean eliminating predators so that tigers are a problem because they kill other organisms and they cause suffering. So maybe a world with no tigers would be better than a world with tigers. But obviously that would conflict with other kinds of environmental values about protecting species and so on. So the thought about what kind of future environment we should create was my third problem. So I want to end by putting up 3 questions that I'd be very honored to hear your views about. Since your tradition is so different, I think that you may have many insights that will help us in environmental ethics to think through these problems in new ways that we have not been thinking about them before. So I will put...
And as you say that, Claire, I think it's interesting to note, Your Holiness, that environmental ethicists actually do have they have a role in the formation of policy in the United States, so that the answers to these sometimes funny philosophical questions actually can be very relevant to concrete outcomes in terms of laws and decisions from the government.
So these are the 3 questions that I would be very interested if you had some thoughts on any of them, Your Holiness.
How do we think about it?
You can read the questions.
Yeah. How do we think about and value future people? How should future people factor into our ethical decision making? So that was the first problem I talked about. The second is, can species or ecosystems be ethically significant in themselves, above and beyond the individuals that compose them? And the third is, what kind of environment should humans be trying to create if they should be in the business of trying to create environments at all? And so I was interested in thinking these questions through from a Buddhist philosophical perspective.
I don't know. Tian Jixung. Jixung Xia.
His Holiness Karmapa said, His Holiness was suggesting that Karmapa and others should pitch in, but His Holiness Karmapa responded that I haven't quite figured out what the questions mean. No. The Langdo Kuyu call, the Langdo Jutan call, some tiny Tatumawa Choke, the Kangan Cartegor Slamna. The Langdo Samatan Bekalia, Leba the Neva, the Chewe, but the Mayoba Shebekal, the Shirupji Shaje, Teletune, Maveta, Lenyaki Shekura, the Shidi Shaya Nalolia, and Tata Yushin be Mikanjang to do Samatangore, Maombat and the Junjugu Midinalia, they do Dina Kyungores, Sing Langjo Nietzsche. The Maombe did mitigate Dina Kyong Bayena. And it Maombe me, they do Dina Kyong Ben, Maombe me, they do the Tata Yube me, they do the Ketchung of Chipujian Siguyore, Tangus to that to the Ketchun Chipujian Sigure, Yanti, the Ketchung of Shaje. Then the something that got stuck that it all could Kangish take those. The neighbor the Dirisha, than the Kuyu than Jeb, Lando Gay shape.
I think I already responded. I think, broadly speaking, when empty space, no question of ethics, then eventually living organism develop without feeling of pains and pleasures. No question of ethics. So then ethics ultimately related with the pains and pleasure and the desire want pleasure, happiness, do not want suffering. On that level, ethics come.
On that basis, no?
On that
basis.
basis. And within that, those mammals who have no sort of intelligence, I think biologically, like mother taking care, those mammals who used to come from
mother's womb,
even including birds, you see, they have some kind of sort of sense of responsibility to look after their youngster. So they also, you see, I think biologically, they know the seasons. And also they know, like birds, they know which season is more available about worms and these things. So they also, some extent, you see, they're thinking about future. Not only just the present moment.
No.
And in fact, if those people who really emphasize present is the only thing, then further question, where is present? Year or century, decade, year, month, day, hour, minute, second, no present. 1 second past, 1 second future,
Yet to
no
come,
present. So the very basis, you see, saying you see present itself, you cannot find.
You cannot find out.
So in any way, so even animal, you see, have some sort of biologically, I think organ toleration.
It's probably at the level of their sensory experience, organ.
This is, they also used to remember about past their experience. May not be generations earlier, but you see their own lifetime, you see some memory. So the past reflect on their mind. And then future, also some extent. But I do not think the animal world, I think no idea of ethics. Ethics only on the basis of experience of pleasure and pains, then also human intelligence. This is more sort of more capacity, thinking, the larger interest and long future, then ethic
becomes relevant.
Come. So that's, I think, only among the mammals, I think only human being, see the concept of ethics. Then also, that also maybe in very early period, the communists say, Marxists say, you see, the original communism, classless society, very small population, everything used equal. So at that period may not be concept of ethics. Everything natural. Then population increase. The very concept of, you see, the identifier, appointing leader. Because now in the society, some unhealthy things, injustices. So the very idea to pinpoint one person, you should lead us, that kind of sort of
concept.
You should look after us. So in order to protect the weaker people's sort of right. Now here, ethics now come. That's my view, of course.
This could be my own personal kind of creation, invention of, so, evolution of ethics, but of course there is not much basis for this. So this is, if you look at the whole evolution of ethics from an overall standpoint, that's how I see it, Holiness was saying.
So naturally, coming generation, nobody deny they have no feeling of pains and pleasure. So we have to take concern about their
Right.
well-being.
Well-being.
Generally, future people. How should future people factor? Then also, the present our experience very much related with past sort of event. So from that, what we learn, what we can learn, is our present behavior may affect on future. Because of experience. The past, something happened. The 20th century become the century of violence. So beginning of this century, still some violence. In spite, every people say peace, peace, peace, but some violence there. Because our negligence in the past century. So we are passing through some difficulties. So what we learn from there? If we behave not well, in future, more trouble. Quite because of that.
Logical.
Then I think the approach, usually sometimes I express because of those people who call specialists, wonderful. They really pick up one particular field, then whole their energy goes on that particular field.
Very deep.
And without much paying attention about holistic.
The bigger picture.
So here, philosopher, just look outside. And then also, I think a lack of some knowledge about relativity. Things are considered absolute. So then look from one angle, find some reality. Consider that's absolute. So these problems happen. So better. So
it seems that it's better to uphold a position that is not really a position.
So I prefer that. Listen, you see this view. Oh yes, that's true. Quite true. Quite true. Not absolute true, but quite true. And then listen this view. Well, oh yes, quite true. There are some reasons. Okay. The things are relative. From this angle, yes, we can see something. From this angle, we can see something. And sort of quite a similar sort of event, right? Compare another thing. Oh, this is some bad event. Compare even worse event. Then this looks okay. Much better. This is good. If that same event compares another event, oh, how bad.
That is horrible.
So everything is relative. That's my view. Maybe some influence of Buddhist sort of
thinking,
Madhyamika philosophical sort of thinking. Meantime, there is sort of demarcation, true, untrue.
So, of course, at the level of everyday experience, we do have to make distinctions between what is true and what is false.
So that's my view. Now, Buddhist brothers, sisters, please speak. Oh, no Buddhist sister. I think here.
So,
There's some Buddhist sisters back there.
Oh, good.
Should be three.
Anything? Say something.
Yes,
Don't push it.
Oh, Indian Buddhist there. You, Indian Buddhist, come away. Indian Buddhist. Our guru, actually, come away. Say something.
Sounds like an order to me. Tanansa. We
always see sort of express or introduce our Buddhist sort of thought come from India, come from Nalanda. So this person, Indian, although my disciple. So we consider ourselves as a student of Indian Guru. So now time, as you mentioned, the time change. So the new reality, student become Guru, and the traditional Guru become Chela. Say something.
Tenzin Priyadarshi from the Dalai Lama, MIT Dalai Lama Center. Did I get that right? Yes.
Well, it is indeed a privilege to be your student, Your Holiness.
Now we should practice this Tibetan sort of tradition.
This is one way I can lose my hair more. But, I think part of the concern from ethicist point is that, well, let me put it this way. You know, when you take a survey of how many students in the United States, for example, would willingly want to enroll in an Ethics 101 class, it's a very rare percentage. The reason being that the reason being that ethics, for some reason, is being taught in a manner that is not very appealing. Meaning, ethics often has been taught as a restraining mechanism. Don't do this, don't do that, and this is the value of this thing. And to a large degree, a theoretical approach to it. Ethics has never been taught in a manner. I think
that's mainly based on religious faith. Right.
Also from the Greek tradition, you know, coming from Aristotle and others. However, when the Buddhists are looking at ethics, they are looking from the point of view of optimization. That how do we, by virtue of exercising ethical behavior, can become more optimal human beings or become more optimal persons. So that is why even aspects, the problems that you raise about future people, at times it just appears to be a bit absurd. That would even arise as a scenario. And in a human being's mind, to address a concern like environment and think and not think about future people, not think about future generation. Even from Buddhist point of view, I think just the idea to even take that as an ethical consideration is an absurdity.
I'm going to give Claire a chance to respond. You don't want to respond? I'm going to respond. Well, I want to make this a little more concrete because this actually has very important ramifications in the context of moving environmental policy forward. So one of the ways in which this is very concrete, it seems sort of ridiculous, but what's important to recall is that the policies that will be made on the basis of the science are going to constrict what others can do. So one famous example that occurred in the Northwest United States was the case of the spotted owl. So the spotted owl was a species that was in the Semchenchiri. And it was an owl that was endangered, a species that was endangered. And a community was making its living by cutting down trees, a community of lumbermen. And they objected very strongly to a new law which required them to stop cutting these trees down, or at least limit the cutting a great deal, in order to protect the owl. So a certain kind of ethical choice was made there to value not just the individual owl, but the species over the individual people. It's a very concrete issue. It's not abstract or absurd. We're doing the same thing with future people. So for example, if we decide now that we're going to make it illegal to hunt, then the people in the world now, of course, who claim, I would love to hunt, I don't want to stop hunting, we're of course restricting their rights, but we're restricting the rights of all of their children and the cultures based on hunting. I'm not saying that hunting is good, but we are making that choice. If we say we're going to make it illegal to raise the temperature more than 70 degrees in your house with the heating, with the talo, then we are making a choice that affects not just us, but our future generations. Those who claim, I want to be warm in my house. Why can't I be warm in my house? So there's a way in which we are forcing future people to abide by our ethical standard. We think we know what is right and wrong, and we say it has to be this way. They have no choice. That's really the issue here. How do we make those choices? How are we going to decide which is good and bad for these people? It's as if we are deciding what is good and bad for others around us. I think that's really the concrete issue in many ways. So to my mind, it's actually quite concrete. I see. Yes, yeah, please.
I think the whole thing about the question of absurdity or not is a measure of our self-grasping. Because just you find it absurd because your concept of in-group, out-group is vast enough that you have genuine concern and you value future generation. I'll give you just the opposite statement from Stephen Forbes, which is an American billionaire, who declared on Fox News that to change our behavior now because the ocean might rise in 100 years, for him is absurd. So he thought that is silly. So this means that he was strictly and only concerned about now and himself. So it's not now or future, it's about me and basically others. So if your self-grasping is so narrow, it's only you. If you extend it a little bit, of course, if it's you, you will find normal to care about what happens to you next year and in 10 years. That nobody will object that. If you extend it a little bit, you will care about your friends, about your family, possibly about the same ethnic group or the same nation. So you extend a little bit. But still a lot of self-grasping that I can care a damn for those who don't exist yet. So it is the ultimate challenge to concern for others and altruism to precisely extend that in-group up till we include all sentient beings. So it's actually a measure of our self-grasping.
It seems to me that we've had two different kinds of presentations of views where people think the alternative to their own view is absurd. That it's absurd to think that we wouldn't include future people, or it's absurd to think that we should restrain our behavior now to prevent something happening in 100 years. And I think that I understand the role of environmental ethics to be saying that something is absurd is not a reason. And we need to provide reasons to support these kinds of intuitions we have about things that are absurd or not. And I think that what you subsequently said was providing a reason for that kind of view.
Jonathan?
This reason in one word is, I don't want to suffer, no one wants to suffer, future sentient beings do not want to suffer. And that's the Buddhist reason for that. Recognition and valuing that.
Let me step out of my role as His Holiness's interpreter and speak in my own voice. One of the things that is being brought very, very sharply into focus in your presentation is the problem of thinking through these questions, because what all of these competing positions show is that there are competing values that we all hold dear. But when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of figuring out what is the best way to behave, sometimes these values conflict. And for example, how do we bring the future generations to factor into our decision making is a very, very important case and example. And I think the key phrase that you're using in all of this is the phrase moral significance. What is the moral significance of future generation in our consideration of ethical responsibility? What is this moral position, significance of ecosystems? So I think the key idea is really moral significance is the key idea. And from the Buddhist point of view, I suppose I could say that the difference between Western style or philosophical style of ethical thinking versus the Buddhist style of ethical thinking is that in the Western style of thinking, there seems to be an assumption that somehow reason can really take you all the way through. That somehow we can find the right rule, then everything will be fine kind of thing. Buddhism does not, although emphasizes the use of reason extensively, but it does not believe in that kind of absolute rule, that somehow you just got to find the rule and then everything will be fine. Because Buddhism, because of its emphasis on relativity that His Holiness was pointing about, how everything is so complex and interrelated that you can look at things from a contextual point of view, that something may seem to be so valuable in one context has less moral significance in another context. So that kind of complex way of looking at issues do not lead... No, so for example, even in the case of the Buddha's own prescriptions on the... So for example, I suppose the closest that the rule-based ethics comes in the classical Buddhist tradition is in the area of monastic codes, the precepts by which monastic members live their lives. So they are very clearly spelled out. You should not do this, you should not do that. And all of these precepts govern the physical and verbal behavior of a monastic member. And these rules are all spelled out. You know, so you have the cardinal ones, then the next layer, and the secondary, and so on. But even in these cases, there are, exceptions made.
One occasion, Buddha say, this should not do. Because
prohibited it.
Prohibited. Then another circumstance, another occasion, different circumstances. Then he insists that you should do.
So it's been modified. So there's a lot of context sensitive.
I think this way. First, object. Then second, allow.
Allow.
The third, you should do.
So it's kind of more proactive.
So the reality, the circumstance is different. So the ultimate sort of aim is benefit.
So ultimate aim is really the benefit principle, is the ultimate aim. Avoidance of harm and bringing benefit. So compassion is the key principle. So to complete, this is where the tension is coming from, and the contrast between kind of classical Buddhist style of ethical thinking versus the Western style of ethical thinking, which is really primarily focused on action and also discovery of hidden rules, whereas the Buddhist style of thinking is more towards development of the character and cultivation of the right kind of motivation and value. And as to the specifics of how to act, then it's sensitive to the context. So it's kind of a completely different style of thinking about ethical issues.
I think that's true.
Let Claire respond and then Roshi. Claire, you had a response.
Yes. So traditionally in Western ethics, there have been sort of three theoretical traditions. One which is focused on bringing about the best consequences and avoiding the worst consequences. One that's essentially been rule-oriented, and it sounds like that's the one that you think is the dominant one. And then virtue, a theory of virtue ethics, which sounds much more like what you're saying the Buddhist tradition is, where the focus is on much more on thinking about yourself as a person. Action is not primary, it's being a good person. That would be important. And virtue ethics is particularly context sensitive. So it might be that it's right to do one thing in one circumstance and wrong to do the same thing in a different context. And that would be very, that would comfortably fit into Western virtue ethics traditions. So that sounds closer than the more kind of rule-oriented traditions. But I'm not sure about it seemed like you were saying there was both a virtue tradition and an idea of trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So it sounds as if both those traditions are going at the same time.
Yeah, both elements are there.
Interesting.
Roshi, you had a comment. Sit down.
So from the Buddhist perspective, we could say that the Theravadan tradition, at least the Vinaya, is more rule-based. And the Mahayana tradition is more compassion-based. And then you could even posit that there's a third perspective, and that's the Buddhayana perspective. And that perspective is a perspective of discerning the nature of reality. More, I don't want to say totally based, but more oriented. More oriented toward rules, one tradition of Buddhism, another tradition more oriented toward compassion, and then a third tradition more oriented toward developing truly the quality of mind that's able to discern into the nature of reality, which is defined in terms of emptiness. So, but that's And there are two dimensions here that are really critical. One is the motivational, the aspirational. Why are we doing this? And I think that's a theme that's really running throughout our conference. For us to understand why, we have to be able to discern reality clearly. And that's reflected, I believe, very much in the third dimension of what we're addressing here, which is to see into the nature of interdependence.
Maybe a little. Right?
So even within Buddhism, there are tendencies, if you will, or lenses that I think are important to consider. And I think it's really essential for us to look at these lenses literally as diopters and to be able to put those three lenses together so that we're able to have depth of field. I think that, developing policy or rules is really important because these act as individual and social constraints. At the same time, to come always from the perspective of compassion is essential. How do we practice non-harming in all ways, and to see that the past is in the present, also the future is in the present. So as His Holiness said, clearly the present doesn't exist per se as an entity. As soon as we try to grasp it, it's the next present, so to speak. But there's also a world of causality and of relationality. And I think that why this question is so interesting to us is that because one of the features that we haven't addressed is the causal dimension.
Diana?
His Holiness expressed his opinions about some of the ethical positions that you described, Claire, like people who don't think future generations count. But you were very careful not to give your own position in your presentation.
You spotted that, huh?
Yes. And so I'm wondering
This is the hot seat now.
Yes. Fellow Englishwoman, I'm wondering if you would like to tell us where your position is.
That is private business.
With respect to all these issues or future generations in particular?
I think on the ecosystems as well. I think that's
Ecosystems
probably
is
the
a
more
very
challenging
important,
one.
Yeah. Well, I am clearer in my view about the question about ecosystems than I am about future generations, which is to say that I think we must take future generations into account in moral decision making. I'm just not sure what the best way of doing that is, or how to weigh them, how to deal with conflicts of interest. So, for instance, while I think compassion is very important, I'm not sure how you deal with cases where compassion for one may conflict with compassion for others. And so so that issue, I'm less clear in my mind what I think about, though I think we must take them into account. In the case of species and ecosystems, while I would like there to be good...
Individual
While I would like to find good arguments to support the idea that either species or ecosystems are significant units in themselves, I have not found those arguments. And most of my work has focused on sentient animals because I think the case there is very clear that we need to change the ways that we treat animals, and that that's something which it's very difficult to argue against. And it seems to me very clear. But I can't find good arguments, although I have tried to construct them and failed, for why we should think that species and ecosystems are important as units themselves. But they're very important to us. And so any policy that is likely to protect them, any policy that takes our long-term and interests and future generations into account is likely to protect species and ecosystems for human-centered reasons and for sentient animals. So you don't necessarily need arguments to say that these things are important in themselves. Now, there are some cases where those concerns come apart, but generally speaking, you get protection for species or ecosystems by being concerned about animals and future generations and human well-being.
I find that interesting that you can't find any arguments for taking an ecosystem or a species as a whole as kind of an object of concern in understanding whether something is virtuous or unvirtuous. That may be the case in Buddhism too, but I wonder, Your Holiness, would you say that is true, that it's very difficult to think of a whole system?
소자다 메다도 대두된 대외에 차네 개침부 송교체 개침부 인버디 좀센도 꼬투레스 에나 코라라 야베 지금 랑원에 개대 간다 즉 소자 대두단 대베도네 셰바 만자바 코라랑 응원에 지금 송교체 고고던데 좀센들레스 좀센 꼬투 자성부터 다는 좀센 코라 뭐라 라마
대두 만드나
나르다 간다 이코시스템 세저로 자체산 다야데 다디 대두뇽의 그 소자다 심지한다 아니 개된 용어부 뜻도 대두 매네 대단 그 소외 내 견단 제외 돈에 디시접디컬 이코시스템 개침부인 버지 다 안티 송교 제국 위에 좀 센데도 고토도스 때이네 간다직 야나 미 대두다 야나 소자 대두뇽의 그 소자 대두단 제네 만제바 데네 개점 마셔봐 코로나랑 랑원 그 돈에 개침부를 쓰는 송교 제고 그래서
아니 쓰면 배부디게
나 배모되게도 이코시스템스라 두고 같이다 코리우 용조 나옴 뜻낭 병원에 지금 만들어
안 되긴 쓰라디 미소 가서 그게 샘딩 소자 마셔고다 하고도 미소자 마셔고 티 에틱 시작합니다.
So this is in a way it's true because if you don't bring into consideration the notion of suffering and happiness, then the whole basis of thinking
and
about
also
morality
the idea
and ethics,
of justice, non-justice.
All of these just disappears. The premise for thinking about ethics is just not there.
다 안다 디어다 가소래. In case say benefit to this group, benefit this group, simply impossible. Get together. There's no other choice. Forget
one sector.
One of these.
Section one section.
Then that there similarly, for temporary, painful, long run benefit. Here also contradiction. So we usually, with human intelligence, we look. Long-term sort of interest is more important than temporary sort of pleasure.
Comfort.
I think those sports are
athletics. Athlete.
I think they really
Train.
spend a lot of time with a lot of sweat.
Sweat,
So immediate, some difficulties, but in order to bring deeper satisfaction, they sacrifice immediate to relax out of the time. Right? So similarly, two groups. So since we already use that, the student, I think students themselves, including myself, when I study, I prefer more holiday, more play, not study. But that's the, for long run, bad. So we must sort of pay more attention for study. So my tutor kept whip always.
Good idea.
to save long term sort of the benefit. So that's every society, we do that.
We practice
in order to seek sort of the long term benefit. Temporary sort of
we make sacrifices in the immediate.
So now similarly, if there is no third choice, either sacrifice one of their sort of the interest in order to get some of the benefit to one. Then
the question is, how do we do this? How do we start thinking about adjudicating between these two competing?
The sacrifice few minorities' right in order to achieve the interest or right to majority. So that's why this democratic system, the best system. That does not mean 100% perfect. But generally speaking, it's much better. I always say the world belongs to humanity, not government, not kings or queens like that, or religious leader. So recently when I was in America, I told America belongs to about 300 million American people, not this party or that party. So similarly, I also was telling my Chinese friend, China belongs to Chinese people, not Communist Party. So in order to govern the country by the people, democratic system is the best. That does not mean the 100% people govern the country. Majority elected one party, support one party, and then rule. So now here like that, the benefit for majority,
wider community,
is more important. If there's no other choice. If there's a choice, both have the right. Both should have sort of the prosperity or good thing. But if there's no other choice, either must sacrifice, then we have to look the majority.
That's a very productive answer, Your Holiness, to that second question. I find it interesting, at least, and I hope that'll be helpful to you, Claire. We do have we had a couple of comments, but I'm afraid that we had agreed that Mathieu Ricard would make some comments, and it's really time to start those comments now. So I must apologize. I'm glad to see we have other questions. There'll be more time for discussion later this afternoon. And also, I'm sure we'll pick up some of these themes tomorrow. So I'd like to make a slight transition now, Your Holiness, although it's not much of a transition. We've been talking about, in part, the rights of non-human beings, especially animals. And Claire herself is actually one of her main areas of expertise is the treatment of animals. That's very appropriate now because we're going to ask the Venerable Mathieu Ricard to make a few comments here. As it turns out, the way in which we treat animals can have a tremendous impact on our environment, as well as the ethical questions that are raised. So, Mathieu, with that in mind, if you would please, we'll make a switch here.
Can we thank Claire?
Yes, thank you, Claire. Yes. Thank you.
So basically, when we say, human right, some sort of, what's it? Come.
You can scoot this way.
Yes, yeah. More space, yeah. So as a Buddhist, when we used to say human right, this is some sort of indication or implication. You human beings have some special right to use other animals. That we cannot say. As far as the right of the pleasant life or existing their life, all sentient beings have equal rights.
Equal rights.
Then we have only one reason. Oh, we have special intelligence, so we should have more right. Otherwise, you see, basically, all have the same feeling of pains and pleasure. So all have same
right to
same
exist.
right.
No.
I think possibly if there was only one single declaration of rights, it would be the right not to suffer, if it's the main overarching one. His Holiness, you often say that the whole Buddhist philosophy can be very simply summarized in the view of interdependence of all phenomena and the behavior of non-violence. And so when you say non-violence, you mean non-violence toward human beings, toward animals, and toward the environment. So interdependence is wisdom, understanding reality, and non-violence is based on compassion. So as part of the whole discussion, you might remember that the documentary of Al Gore, and which also based on the research with Jonathan Patz about environment, was called A Most an Inconvenient Truth. And what I'm going to speak...
Inconvenient.
And the question of the way we exploit and treat animals in a very vast way is a very uncomfortable truth, because we also feel very strong resistance to objectively consider the way we treat animals. And so first of all, since we are also self-interested, and we need to begin by some scientific data to relate to all the discussion that has been done, and which is to do the way now we use animals in a very massive way, industrial way. What impact does it have on the environmental issue? So of course I'm not, as you know, a climatologist scientist, but I have been very motivated by that question, and I did some research which I checked with the scientists themselves. So first, the contribution to climate change. And so what we mean by livestock is all the animals, farm animals, and especially industrial farming, because in the United States, 99% of meat production is not in the fields, it's industrial farming, whether veals or poultry. That contributes vastly to climate change. 18% of the greenhouse emission, which is global warming, comes from using animals for meat. And that's the second main factor. The first one being housing, the way we live. And we spoke a lot about transportation, but that's apparently only the third one. And one of the explanations is that the emission of methane, also the transportations of grain towards those industrial farming and so forth. Why Diana just told me last night that the methane that is emitted by the livestock is 25 times more active in causing greenhouse effect than the CO2, the carbon dioxide. So that's why also it has a huge impact. But the good news is that methane only remains for 10 years active to cause that greenhouse effect, while carbon dioxide can remain up to 100 years. So that's why the IPCC, the UN report, strongly stressed that one of the fastest and easiest way, in fact, to immediately and very soon, within 10 years, have an effect on reducing the greenhouse effect would be simply to reduce significantly our consumption of meat, because that will not be so much of the livestock. So that's both a very strong effect and also...
뒤균도 사에 샤데 가 축체스 용을 땅배는 뒤도는 덴덴 쇼견 요베 미통토 그래서.
So to give an example, to produce 1 kilo of meat, that means through all the chains that leads to that, the land that will be devoted to that, the grain that will be devoted to that, the methane and so forth, produce 50 times more greenhouse gas than producing 1 kilo of wheat, which is equally good food. Now, the waste. Waste is a major cause of pollution, atmospheric pollution, pollution of the rivers, creating dead zones in the ocean and so forth. In the United States alone, the industrial farming produces 130 times more waste than the whole human population. So there's huge difference.
Human population in the States.
Yeah, the pollution, the waste.
Yeah, no, the population is in the States.
The population of the United States,
United
yes.
States.
So 130 times, because it's one of the countries that has the biggest industrial farming. Now, the other aspect we told that Jonathan pointed yesterday is the ethical effect, that the nations that are most contributing to global warming are affecting, those who are suffering are those who contribute less, and so the poorest nations suffer from the actions of the richest nation. So what does that translate in terms of this question of animal rising? It takes 10 kilos of vegetable protein that could be used as very good food by the poor people to produce 1 kilo of meat. So it is basically a very bad outcome, only at 10%. Not only that, but the meat production is supposed to double by 2050. And all at the cost of the poorest nation. Why? Because with 1 hectare of land, you can easily feed 20 vegans or 1 meat eater. Now, if you look at the distribution, so the livestock use about 2/3 of all available lands. That's not big forest or mountain range, but available lands. Now, if you look who is eating meat, here you have a graph. That's clearly the richest nation. They use much more meat. That means at the cost of the protein that could be feeding the poorest nation. And the difference is absolutely huge. You can see down here, India, average is about few kilos a year. United States is 120 kilos. That's about 60 times more meat consumption per inhabitant. So of course, it's a dramatic difference because as I mentioned, to make 1 kilo of meat, you need 10 kilos of vegetable proteins. That's how good, perfectly good food. And then water is the very scarce resource, especially in many, many poor countries. The access of water is very limited. They only get polluted water. They have to walk 10 or 20 kilometers to get water. The women have to go at 4 in the morning to fill buckets. It's a terrible thing. But again here, producing 1 kilo of wheat requires 50 times less water than producing a kilo of meat. Now, if you look at also the impact on health, in the United States, 60% of all antibiotics used in the United States are used to just keep industrial farm animals alive until the moment they are killed. That could be used for medical purpose. Why they do that? Why do they do that? Because they cannot care for individual animals. In one case, there is 90,000 chicken in one place looked by 3 people. So they cannot treat individual animals, so they put mass antibiotics. That not only could be used for medical purpose, but also create resistance to antibiotic. It goes in the reverse and it a lot of side effects. Now, the good news is we could now feed 1.4 billion people simply by not using the 775 million tons of grain that is used to fill livestock to make meat. So 1.4, the poorest nation could be fed simply by stopping eating meat. Now, even we have very selfish interests, only think about ourselves. Now, a lot of more and more studies, especially about eating red meat, has shown that it increased 20% the risk of colonic cancer. So altogether, this big study on 500,000 people I've shown that altogether, 11% death of men and 16% in women worldwide could be avoided by reducing the consumption of meat. So that's also a significant health issue. So just if you stop one day, all United States, North America, one day avoiding meat, you could feed every day for a whole year 25 million poor people. Just avoiding eating meat for one day doesn't seem too much. So the ethical issue now, worldwide, 120 billion land animals are killed every year for human consumption. 1.5 trillion sea animals. The trillion doesn't mean much, so I translated into 1.5 million of millions. That's such a huge number. Just simply for satisfying our needs. A single company, Tyson Food, kills 10 million chicken per week. No, those are big numbers. Also, intensive fishing is gradually leading to extinction of many species of fish. Huge impact on biodiversity. They go deeper and deeper in the ocean. First, they exhaust the species that are on the top, and then you can see the main fishes that were fished 100 years ago, they were those on the surface. Then a little bit deeper, then a little bit deeper. So now they are scratching the bottom of the ocean. So that's also terrible for biodiversity, for the whole ocean. The extinction, 95% of the whale population has disappeared. So there's so many of those data. Now, while they do that, there's immense amount of waste just to get half a kilo of shrimps. Because of regulation, they are not allowed to fish that, they are not allowed to fish this, but they catch it in their nets. They have to throw back to the ocean 13 kilos of other sea animals, fishes and so forth, that they are not allowed to bring back. So for half a kilo, 13 kilos of other fishes are just thrown back, dead. Now, what is comes from an attitude of animals have no value as human beings. So this is a quote from a manager of the whole meat company, one of the largest companies in the United States. So the breeding sow, that's a female pig, should be treated as a valuable piece of machinery whose function is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. So that's a very wonderful vision about other sentient beings. To give a very few images without showing disturbing images and films about what's going on. Again, 99% of meat animals are in industrial farming. They live about 1/60. That means one of their lifespan. I mean, if a cow should live 10, 15 years, they live 6 months. In horrible conditions. A chicken in industrial farming can live their short life in the size of an A4 size paper, no more. The veals, they are put in boxes.
Yes.
They can't even have space to turn and lick their back. Because we want white meat, because it looks better,
yes,
they cannot have iron. So if there's any iron, they try to lick. So the farmers remove the iron. So all kinds of things like that. It's just unbelievable what is being done. So then why do we do that? Because we think basically human beings are so superior. So what is basically altruism? Altruism is valuing other sentient beings, having concern. What we see in genocides, very often, like in Rwanda and so forth, they devalue human beings. They treat them like rats, vermin, impure. Now, in animals, it goes one step further. They are treated as objects, commodities, farm products. This is what the vocabulary you can find. Instead of killing, they speak of harvesting animals, just like if they were objects. So I think that's the idea that man is so superior. So why? Basically, we say, oh, human beings are so intelligent, so clever, they have long-term things, they can have wonderful lives. Animals don't have that. But the question that Western philosophers ask, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So in terms of being your throat slit by a knife, it doesn't matter if you are a professor of university or a cow. Basically, none of them desires that. So I think that's one of the main reasons. There are many other arguments given. Nature is like that. Animals eat each other. So what's the point of having intelligence if we cannot have a little bit more compassion? Because of course, an animal only eat what they need. They don't increase their consumption out of limits. And the other reason is animals don't suffer. That was until very recently, people were thought they're just like robots. And you said the question about whether fish suffer. No, it has been found that fishes have just the same neurotransmitter that's called for pain. Why should they have it if they don't suffer? It has been found that lobsters, when they are put in boiling water, they suffer a lot. So that's also new scientific evidence. So it stays to this idea that we are so superior that we can do anything we want. So that's ethically extremely wrong. So it has led people to say that this is ethically intolerable. Here is a quote from a Nobel Prize of Literature, Isaac Bashevis Singer, whose whole family was killed in concentration camps. And he was so struck by the similarity that he said, man has convinced himself that all other creatures were created merely to provide him with food, pelts, to be tormented, exterminated. In relation to them, all people are Nazis. For the animal, it is an eternal Treblinka. It means a concentration camp. But the difference is that we do it again and again, year after year, everywhere, all the time. So at the same time, Mahatma Gandhi said the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. So here we have a problem that is vast, that is immense. But the solution is so simple. It doesn't require stopping traveling. It doesn't require stopping do what we do. It requires one simple decision. Stop eating meat. It's so simple. Anything else in your life that can be done. And I want to end with a quote of George Bernard Shaw, who said, animals are my friends, and I don't eat my friends.
Thank you, Mathieu.
Wonderful. Wonderful. My first visit Japan, the organizer showed me on poultry, big farm.
Big farm, poultry farm.
I was told about 200,000 chicken. They're small.
Spaces, no, in small cages.
And collect egg. Like prison. And I asked, after around 2 years, they're no longer egg. And what to do?
Finish. Even worse, Your Holiness, when the production of egg goes down a little bit, they cannot treat separate animals. So it's cheaper to kill 90,000 and to start from scratch than to find other means. So they just kill all of them and start again. That's because of the rule of doing faster, more production, and as fast as possible.
And then sometimes because of the bird illness, bird flu,
Bird flu. Bird flu.
Millions and millions will kill. And then as well as cows.
Cows,
cattle. And then as you mentioned, the fish, limitless.
Yeah, limitless.
And sometimes I notice, of course the other countries also, I think, I notice some Japanese, see hook, because of the catch. And some play. Not play, out of sort of because the pain and also out of fear. They jump like that. They consider this playing. Then catch, then because of the two.
So it's people do fishing for sport. Yeah. Then they catch the fish, and then after a while they unhook it and let the fish in the water again.
So I think your presentation really is convincing and really wonderful. So I appreciate it. Thank you. And then another thing, I think people from childhood, fishing, hunting, no sort of sense of concern of their life or their pain. That eventually, towards human being,
Slowly.
go. So till you yourself, you see, because of touch, so no sort of concern about others' pain, shooting, beating. So our compassion, our sense of concern must start from
Young age,
no.
From the smallest animal.
Animal or insect. Or mosquito, I often used to tell, my relation with mosquito is not very good. Otherwise, we Tibetan, as a Buddhist community, from childhood, because we get sort of some kind of habit. Do not kill, even a small animal. So then, killing human being, big shock. Nowadays, even 100,000 people killed, not much shock. I think really that's a very serious matter, very, very serious matter. So our love and compassion, respect, the right of small insect, I think that's the basis of genuine, built-in, compassionate world. Very important, isn't it? Very important. In the meantime, I myself non-vegetarian.
But Holiness,
65, I give up.
1965.
I give up sort of non-vegetarian food. So I practice strictly vegetarian
diet.
No egg, nothing. So then I took a lot of nuts and creams, according some my Indian friend, according their
advice.
Their sort of advice.
Yeah.
So then after 20 months, the gallbladder survey, jaundice survey, hepatitis,
jaundice.
Oh, not the other one.
Gallbladder.
Oh, gallbladder. Oh.
Yes.
So then whole my sort of skin become yellow. My eye, nails, everything become yellow. So later I describe, at that time I become truly living Buddha. Chinese word, living Buddha. Actually wrong translation. But become living Buddha not through spiritual practice, but through illness. So then, according to Tibetan physician, as well as the Ayurvedic sort of physician, and they advised me I should carry the traditions of the original
previous diet.
food style. Meantime, since my childhood, I think my age, 13, around 13, in Tibet, all Tibetan government official festival
Functions.
transform complete vegetarian.
Food at all the official functions.
Then, solo tambo phejiringe chikhajidayo.
And also a saving animal, from the butchers, over 10,000.
Whenever I saw some sort of herds, you see, coming to the butcher's place, I cannot sort of remain.
So I feel kind of something very uncomfortable and almost itching around my necks.
So I really feel now my sort of health now because of the age, 70 now almost 77.
76.
I feel some positive result from these actions. I feel. Then in India, the refugee community, in early 60s, some volunteer agencies, you see, they advise us, poultry is very
for income generation.
And then few settlement, you see, they accepted, so they set up poultry, but supposed not for killing, but only for eggs. But other hand, other cases like piggery, fishery, right from beginning, we do not accept that. Then deduce poultry, some settlement. Yeah. So I asked, what is because of the purpose? They say egg. Then I asked, when they egg, their age, so finished, stop. Now what to do? No clear answer. Then I pleaded. If this poultry is highly essential for their economic condition, then I have no right, because I have nothing to say.
Same.
But if not that sort of serious,
crucial,
then please close. I think 20, 30 years since all close. Then our monastic institutions, all major monastic institutions, they have common kitchen. I think 10, 15 years. Now common kitchen, all serving vegetarian food. So here a little bit of contradiction. Myself, non-vegetarian, but in the meantime, telling people should be vegetarian.
Your Holiness, in India, there's this concern about health. So in general, worldwide, of course, individual cases might be different. But in India, there are between 250 to 400 million vegetarian. It seems they're doing pretty well. So
true, that's true.
If you have a balanced diet, I think this is not an issue. I've been for 40 years. I feel pretty good right now.
And the other thing, actually, Your Holiness, that we heard from Greg was, in fact, that even if one is not able to become a strict vegetarian, simply a reduction in one's consumption of meat can have a tremendous impact, not only, of course, on, on the maltreatment of animals, but also on the environment. And this is one of the easy ways for us to, we've asked our public, our viewing public on the internet and so on, to consider reducing eating meat just a little bit so that they can help us to recoup the cost of this, the environmental cost of this conference. It's a very easy way to do it. One doesn't have to become a strict vegetarian. That's a good thing to do, obviously. But if one doesn't feel capable of that, even reducing meat can be very helpful. No question.
Yes, my kitchen. I think once a week, non-vegetarian, otherwise vegetarian food. Very good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Thank you again, Your Holiness, for this afternoon's conversation. It's very much appreciated. We'll move into our tea break now, and we'll reconvene at 3:15 for our discussion with our gathered monastics, with the members of the Environmental Office, teachers from the TCV, and so on. Thank you very much.
Ecosystem services. But I wanted to separate them because I think interest in beauty and the value of place are not easily captured by using the language of services. They're really things that we value rather than services that are provided to us. So some philosophers argue that natural beauty has some kind of intrinsic value for us. And certainly beauty has been something that has underpinned the protection of the natural world in many places, especially in the United States, where the national parks were formed in beautiful places initially. However, there are some concerns about weighing natural beauty or beauty too heavily. For instance, ideas about what's beautiful have changed over the centuries. So somewhere that's protected may lose value. Another concern is that some ugly things may be very ecologically valuable. So a corpse full of maggots may not be very beautiful, but will be very significant for other reasons. And
그래서 풍부도 가야지.
나를 풍부나로다 근데 무슨 사이드가 풍부되잖아. 따두건 제제
and equally, there could be something very beautiful, like a beautiful sunset, that we later discover was caused by pollution. So the cause there may be problematic. So that's some ideas about beauty. Place is also very important to people. People become rooted in particular places and come to value the places in which they live and will try very hard to protect those places. And again, the value of place has been very important in environmental protection. So again, this can be problematic. So it might be that people protect a place against, for instance, putting windmills there to generate wind power. So sometimes valuing place can conflict with other kinds of environmental values. So those are two kinds of ideas. The third idea, human-centered concern, I have here is a concern for justice. And this has already arisen several times. Jonathan talked about environmental justice issues yesterday. And here the concerns are about the ways in which the environment can be a cause of injustice between different groups of people. So, for instance, one group of people might capture a natural resource and prevent other people from accessing it without consulting them and without compensating them. This might happen, for instance, if a dam is built, and that may have the effect, people are pushed off the land. They don't benefit from the electricity that's generated. They didn't cause their own movement, but they end up suffering disproportionately. And there are very many kinds of cases like this. And environmental ethicists have spent much time thinking about these justice issues. The fourth area of big debate is thinking about future people, people that don't yet exist. And I'm not going to say anything more about this here because this is one of the main disputes that I want to talk about later. So now I'll move over from the human-centered to the non-human-centered views and talk about these views.
Well, Your Holiness, I hope that everyone has had an enjoyable lunch and that you have as well. Welcome back to you all. We'll now be moving. Rela, ngansu the consular shusai. Oh.
All Tibetan in free country. Tomorrow fasting.
Tomorrow is
yes.
fasting.
Yes. Yes.
Some of our supporters.
Yes.
I hope.
So His Holiness is referring to the fact that tomorrow morning, actually, you already know that there will be a memorial service for the various members of the monastic community who have been protesting even with their own bodies in Tibet. And in partial honor of that, tomorrow, I understand, is a day of fasting in the Tibetan community, in the free Tibetan community. So we will be beginning late on that rather sober note, but in some ways an appropriate note because it then brings us into the realm of ethical action and activism in general. And we'll begin by the consideration of ethics, Your Holiness, this afternoon. Some 2 years ago, we began planning for this meeting when Dan Goldman and I first were given the green light by the Mind and Life XXİ to plan the meeting. We started to think about what were the essential elements in understanding the environmental crisis. And we were joined pretty soon within our planning process by Jonathan Patz on our committee. And it became evident, in part because of Jonathan's own work in ethics and science, that ethics are a crucial component in the environmental crisis. In some ways, of course, as you pointed out, one role of ethics, a very important role of ethics, is to guide our actions once we have understood what is in fact the case. In other words, once science gives us a clear understanding of the scientific issues, the reality that we face, we then have the question of what our ethical choices might be. But also, there is a way in which ethics precedes the science. For example, just to give you one example, on May 21st of this year, it was claimed that the world would end. There was a man named Howard Cutler, a very well-known radio personality, who had convinced a very large number of his followers.
So
next year.
when would it end?
That's this last year,
I see.
May 21st.
I heard number of people ask 2012.
Also,
That's end of world.
yes,
Nonsense.
yes. Well, it was
Then no need on serious discussion.
yes,
Everybody then relax and alcohol.
yes.
Then wait that day.
There were many parties on that day, actually, Your Holiness. Surprisingly, many people took this very seriously. Some people in the United States actually sold their possessions.
Really?
Yes. Went up into the mountains.
How easy to fool.
Yes. But the problem is there's even a significant percentage of the American voters who believe that the world probably will end relatively soon. Maybe not the May 21st, but in the not too distant future. With that attitude in place, there's no point in trying to preserve our environment. Environmental science is a waste. When I was doing my research to look for someone who might be able to help us to understand these environmental ethical issues, I read various articles and I came across an article that Dr. Palmer had written that was amazingly clear. It laid out the various positions within environmental ethics and the way that philosophers throughout the world are thinking about environmental ethics. So that's actually part of what she will do today. She will introduce us to some of the key positions in environmental ethics and then raise for us some interesting questions that we might consider in the conversation. So, Dr. Palmer.
I'm honored to be able to meet you and to talk to you today. And as John said, my role in this conference is to introduce some perspectives from environmental ethics. So what I'll do is say something about the key positions in environmental ethics, and then I'll talk about 3 fundamental problems about which environmental ethicists are still arguing. So Diana, Jonathan, and Greg have introduced us to some ideas about different kinds of impacts that we have on the environment. What environmental philosophers do is to pick up on that work and then think about, well, what values are at stake here? What kinds of ethical issues do these raise? How should we behave with response to these particular kinds of problems? So that's what we see our role as being. So I should just say something about the field of environmental ethics. It's relatively new. Really began in the late 1970s, early 1980s, but has grown a lot. And now there are many universities across Europe, in the United States, and Australasia that teach environmental ethics. However, because it's a younger field, or maybe not because, maybe it always will be, it's very contested. There is very little consensus.
tun조시라면 되지. 따주 담을 초계 담을 망부시고 지금 랑조 담을 망부 여비체. 아니야 따주 초지도 틈부터시라요 말해서 나온다. 저 따주부터네. The environment 그 랑도 콜 주도 콜 계시고 연장.
There's very little consensus about basic positions in the field about the fundamental questions, or even what those questions are, let alone how to answer them. And as I'm sure that you have seen when you have met philosophers before, wherever there are 2 philosophers in a room, there will be at least 3 opinions. And environmental ethicists are just the same as that. So
that's why more reason to believe scientists. I think the fact is the reality, many aspects. 직직다 직디 제순장배 똑배 뭐 내주셔서 전투하면 봐.
It is a fact that there's no way a one word and the concepts that is based upon that, derived from that word, is ever going to capture reality.
자자가 자도 세워주고 무슨 두해주고 써야 돼.
So therefore, in Buddhist philosophy, a distinction is made between the way
Not
in
only
which,
Buddhist philosophy.
in classical Indian,
In Indian philosophy.
classical Indian
Last,
philosophy,
I think more than 3,000 years.
a distinction is made in the way in which, direct perceptual experience engage with the world vis-a-vis conceptual thoughts. Thoughts tend to be very selective and pick on only a facet of reality, whereas direct experience can engage with the object much more kind of, in a kind of a direct way.
So naturally, the philosophical sort of thinking so pick up one aspect. It's true. At the meantime, if that philosopher say this is the only truth, then mistake. That different aspect from different angle, isn't it? Okay. Yes.
So we cannot be gurus.
따루마오서 라마 지야요 말았어. 자리보서 구루 숭부와. 따루마오서 구루 될 수고요 말았어.
Semi guru.
Semi-guru. Semi-guru. Quasi-guru.
There is, though, one thing on which most environmental ethicists do agree, and that is that we're seeking reasons and explanations for the kinds of values that people hold. So when people make claims that something should be protected or something is important, philosophers are asking, well, why do you say that? What reasons do you give for that? And that's been one of the jobs that environmental ethicists have undertaken. So unlike my colleagues in the sciences, I only have 2 slides, well, 3 after this first one. And I'm going to use one slide, which John helped me design yesterday, to outline some of the basic kinds of positions in the field. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. So as you can see, if you look at this slide, there's a fundamental kind of divide between 2 sorts of concerns. So one kind of concern is human-centered, and the other a non-human-centered. And that's been a big debate within environmental ethics. Now, of course, some human concern, they're not necessarily in opposition to one another. So something could benefit both humans and non-humans at the same time. So co-benefits, to use the term that Jonathan used yesterday.
레펜준이가래야 초타지도 계획 잡았잖아요 말했어. 간다가이네 지 멜팽규는 미마이 베트르레다 기응어들을 펜통이들 용스 그러봤다. 이나 자외 따단들이야. 미케제 진이 미대 된 것도네. 삼만단단 직다. 야 미마이 베지다 야 튼루다. 기응어 공부 개체 진. 엔디 토네 야 랑도주단 개시나시 다 랑초로 싸워니
And it seems to me that if you're going to have co-benefits, you'll have to have co-harms as well. So something could harm everything, some action that we perform. So what I want to do is to start on this side and talk about some of these human-centered positions. So the first one I've outlined here, I've called ecosystem services. And this concept was something we talked about yesterday. So these are the free services that nature provides to human beings. And environmental ethicists have been interested in this because they point out that this is very important for our own well-being, that we recognize the ways in which we are dependent on the natural world, and that can be denied in our practices. But they want to emphasize that for prudential reasons, for our own well-being, we need to think about this. So that's the first one. I'm not going to say very much about that. The second idea, ideas about beauty and ideas about place, these are sometimes included within
time. Those types of attitudes can be very destructive for the science itself and can be an obstacle to science.
We also have We Buddhists also have some kind of similar way of expression. That's
So for example, like there is no real point to
Life is pointless.
intrinsic meaning to the existence of
this life. This life. We must think about next life.
Yes. Or
So therefore, 1954 and 55, when I was in Peking, one occasion Chairman Mao told me Buddhism, religion is poison, opium. Then he mentioned two reasons. One, great sort of harmful for population. It's half true. Then he mentioned the Buddhist sort of faith. There's a reduced interest about development.
Progress.
Progress. So anyway, if you
misinterpreted.
holistic map
So if you don't understand a particular concept within its wider context, you can easily misunderstand these kind of ideas.
Yes. And this also points, Your Holiness, to the question of values, another which is very connected with ethics. Another issue, for example, that really also came up this morning is if we really only value profit, and that's all we're concerned with, we might not care about the environment or the impact it has on others. So with that attitude, one's own political power and economic power would actually seek to block environmental science because it's an obstacle, one might think, to profit. This might be a confused notion, but it still could be the way that one would act. So ethics are actually important even before the scientific work. I think it's a crucial issue to understand how we have found ourselves in this environmental crisis. So with that in mind, what we had to do was go out and find an ethicist. And we did so in the form of Dr. Claire Palmer. Dr. Palmer is now a professor at Texas A&M University, where she is in the Department of Philosophy. She did her graduate work and indeed all of her university training at Oxford University. But she has a background not only in philosophy, also in religion. And much of her work is at the intersection, the meeting places of religion, philosophy, and the environment. Much of her work has focused on animal ethics and the treatment of animals. And for that reason, also this afternoon, toward the end of our session, we're going to ask the Venerable Mathieu Ricard to pick up that theme after our conversation about Dr. Palmer's presentation. Venerable Mathieu Ricard would say something about our treatment of animals. Back to Professor Palmer then. She was the president of the International Society for Environmental Ethics from 2007 to 2010. She founded an important journal in this new area of philosophy called Worldviews, Environment, Culture, Religion. And she's also co-authoring now a book on the ethics of companion animals, our pets. What kinds of ethical positions and attitudes should we have or might we have toward our pets? Her most recent book, if I recall correctly, is Animal Ethics in Context from Columbia University in 2010. She has also co-edited a number of volumes, including the 5-volume collection called Environmental Philosophy from Routledge, which came out in 2005. And part of the reason that